Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the seminar, I want to welcome you to the second day of the symposium. My name is Marielena Martinez, and I'd like to take just a couple of minutes to thank the Center for Feminist Research for the support for the seminar, and in particular Macarena Gomez Barris for her direction of the seminar and for really doing much of the heavy lifting during this year. So thank you, Macarena, for your wonderful. And so yesterday was a wonderful, I thought was just a wonderful day from the keynote to the discussion. And a couple of things that stand out for me is the issue of the relationship between theory and on the ground, or sort of archival work. And I'd like to just briefly just suggest and propose that we think about them not as things that are opposed, but really as mutually enriching. And apropos that, for me, that's in part where my own affection for the archive comes from. And so the other thing that I want to sort of propose is that we talk about how our own emotions, our own sentiments with regard not just to archives, but to our historical subjects, the way that they shape what we end up writing. And so I'm just sort of anticipating some of the questions that I'm going to ask the presenters today. And so today we have two morning panels. We are starting a little bit late, so I'm going to try to have us stick to the time. Each presenter is going to have about 25 minutes, and then we're going to try to end by 10:40 and have a 5-minute recess and go on to the second panel. So let me introduce. I'm just really excited about the two presenters, and Gabriela Cano is a historian and professor at the Colegio de Mexico. Her research interests include the history of gender and sexuality in Mexico, and her publications include a biography. The biography se llamaba Elena Arizmendi. And for those of you who don't know who Elena Arizmendi is, she was the companion, the lover of none other than José Vasconcelos, who coined the term the cosmic race, la raza cósmica. One of the people that elaborated this such an influential idea about the racial specificity of Latin America. And if you watch programs coming from UNAM and from Mexico City, you will not miss Gabriela being interviewed. It was a very extremely well and widely received book. And she's also edited a book on the works of Amalia de Castillo Ledón, and in English co-edited Sex in Revolution, Gender, Power, and Politics in Post-Revolutionary Mexico. She is currently preparing a book on Amelio Robles' transgendered masculinity, and you will learn a little bit about Amelio Robles during the talk. Her talk today is focused on Amelio Robles. Tavia Nyong'o is Associate Professor of Performance Studies at New York University, where he writes, researches, and teaches critical Black studies, queer studies, cultural theory, and cultural history. His first book, The Amalgamation Waltz, Race, Performance, and the Ruses of Memory, won the Errol Hill Award for Best Book in African American Theater and Performance Studies. He has published articles on punk, disco, viral media, the African diaspora, film and performance art in many venues, including the Radical History Review, Criticism, Women's Studies Quarterly, The Nation, and so forth. He's also on the editorial collective of Social Text. So welcome to both of you, and I'm really thrilled to hear both of your presentations. I think we're going to stick with the order, so Gabriela Cano will speak first.
Good morning. It is an honor for me to be part of this conversation with this fabulous group of scholars and to be in the one gay and lesbian archives here at USC. I want to thank everyone involved in making this symposium possible, and especially I want to thank Marilena Martinez for the invitation. I'm going to read my paper. I'm going to stick to what I have here, and maybe if there's time for questions, we can talk more about the archive and the problems. The title of this paper was inspired by reading Anne Stoller's Against the Grain, Along the Grain. The Amelio Robles archive, Script Masculinity. In a previous essay, I told the story of how Amelio Robles effectively achieved transgendering in early 20th century Mexico by joining the Zapatista faction of the Mexican Revolution around 1913. Young Amelia Robles began a process of masculinization that constituted itself as a gender identity he sustained for the remainder of his life. Unlike, it's Amelio on the left, obviously. Unlike other women who choreographed stress during the armed struggle and participated in battles, eventually obtaining ranks as lieutenants or sergeants, but who at the end of the war, however, reassumed their female identity, Amelio Robles maintained his masculine identity until his death in 1985 at the age of 94. I argue that Amelio Robles' change in gender identity was permanent due to the fact that it obeyed to a desire to transition from a female gender identity to a masculine identity, a desire that today we would describe as a process of transgendering. Up until now, I have interpreted the masculinity of Robles as a gender performance, creating using the limited cultural resources available to him in a rural Mexican town during the early 20th century. Thus, attire, pose, and attitude, but above all photography, allowed him to convey the desired body image in studio portraits that legitimized his look as an elegant urban man. These studio portraits, widely extended since the early 20th century, even in rural areas, constructed the desired image of persons who generally appeared in photographs wearing their best clothes and holding props that suggested distinction and elegant surrounding, and more elegant surroundings than those they inhabited on a daily basis. The other studio, one of those studio portraits was published in the press. I go into that in what I published on Robles. The other studio portrait, unpublished until now, presents Robles dressed in a city suit, posing in the mock interior of an elegant mansion. Taking advantage of studio portrait conventions, Amelio Robles was transfigured on two planes. On one hand, he displayed before the camera an irrefutable masculinity, and on the other, he passed as the urban man who poses before a backdrop representing a fancy curtain. He poses inside what seems to be one of the majestic homes built under the impetus of Porfirian economic development. By the way, did little change in the living conditions of Robles in a rural community from which one could live only on horseback or on foot, and where electricity and drinking water did not arrive until well into the 20th century. While the Robles family possessed some lands, their way of life was transformed very little either by Porfirian or post-revolutionary modernization. The gender performance of Robles subverted and at the same time endorsed the aggressive, violent masculinity that flourished during the war, and once the armed struggle had ended, nourished the creation of revolutionary heroes and symbols of nationalist masculinity such as Emiliano Zapata and Francisco Villa, who were pillars in the memory of the revolution. Paradoxically, the Robles' story subverts this masculinity because it proves that the characteristics of courage and aggressiveness are a construction rather than a natural disposition among bodies of the male sex. The masculinity of Robles was more lasting than his urban identity, given that Amelio Robles lived as a rancher during the rest of his life, always maintaining his links to his hometown, although in some periods he resided in cities such as Iguala and Chilpancingo in central Guerrero. Except when he traveled to Mexico City and wore an urban suit, Robles dressed in a rural manner, always preserving a masculine appearance. For example, it's Robles on the dark shirt. The photographs available at different stages in his life show that he showed him always wearing men's shirts with chest pockets that somehow conceal his curves. I now add to my argument regarding Robles' gender performance as constructed upon photography, pose, and attire, the idea that the masculinization of Robles was also a script practice. His name, written in the masculine, either typed out or signed by hand, transferred repeatedly to the documents that comprise his archive, is yet another dimension of his transgendering. I now attempt to distance myself from the extractive usage criticized by Ana Laura Stoller that I have made of the Robles papers in order to assume a critical approach to the formation of his archive and ask myself, how was it possible that a country man with a very rudimentary level of literacy, who spent his entire life in towns and in small towns, this is his native town, in one of the poorest, in Guerrero, one of the poorest states in the country, with the highest indexes of marginalization, stamped out his personal story in masculine by signing official documents under the name of Amelio Robles, used identified photographs that left no room for doubt regarding his masculinity, and succeeded in having his version endorsed by the nation's top military officials. The greatest achievement of his script masculinity was to have obtained recognition as a veteran of the Mexican Revolution and the distinction of revolutionary merit for his armed service. This did not occur until the year 1970, when Amelio Robles was an elderly man in his 80s. During the presidential administration of Luis Echeverría, a period characterized by the persecution and annihilation of guerrilla movements that had arisen in the state of Guerrero over the previous decades. It is important to point out that the veteran status was a form of recognition awarded not only to men, but also to those few women who were able to prove their revolutionary merits. In these cases, the official documentation of the Secretariat of National Defense refers to them generally as veteranas in the feminine. Except for the Amelio Robles file, I have found no other case in the military archives in which a female name is masculinized. Thus, Amelio Robles managed to impose upon the military bureaucracy of the Mexican state his own version with a masculine identity of his participation in both military feats and the social and political movements of the 20th century. The local history of the Mexican Revolution in Guerrero emphasizes his involvement in the Zapatista movement during the armed struggle, because both Emiliano Zapata and Zapatismo possess an aura of romantic rural rebellion. However, it is worthwhile to note that Robles also acted as as a part of the Mexican army during combat against an uprising that took place in 1924 in opposition to the Álvaro Obregón regime, and that the bonds of affect he formed during this stage were crucial to consolidating his script masculinity, as well as incorporated him into the corporative organization that constituted a formidable apparatus of domination over rural and urban workers alike. Of particular importance was the strengthening of his friendship with General Adrián Castrejón, a former Zapatista who became governor of the state of Guerrero from 1933 to 1936, and who later on would head the Zapatista Front affiliated to the Institutional Revolutionary Party, PRI, a very active organization both in for decades during the Cold War. The masculinized name of Robles, duly backed by ID photographs, appears in the dozens of documents that comprise his archive. Forms, petition, filed for the authorities, personal ID cards, letters of recommendation, and even an apocryphal birth certificate establishing the birth of a baby boy, Amelio Robles, who was presented by his father to the authorities. Except for the sex of the baby, the birth certificate contains precisely the same information that appears in the birth registry book in his hometown that I was able to find, but not photograph. But what is the Amelio Robles archive? It is a corpus consisting of dozens of Amelio Robles' personal documents that range from the mid-1920s to the mid-90s, nearly 10 years after he passed away. The majority of these documents are the applications that Robles filled with various authorities requesting recognition as a veteran of the Mexican Revolution. Significantly, the archive includes no documents dating back to the period in which Robles acted as a guerrilla fighter in the ranks of the Revolutionary Army of the South under Emiliano Zapata's command, a stage we now know only by means of memories and reference written at later times. That is to say, the production of Amelio Robles' documents began during the brief period in the mid-20s when he offered his services in the Mexican Army. The Robles archive is comprised of two individual files located in two different archival institutions of federal scope, both which are located in the nation's capital. The first of these files is located in the Veteran Division of the Secretariat of National Defense and preserves documentation related to Robles' request for veteran status and military pension issued from 1955 to 1978. The other file is broader in scope and more varied. It contains documents preserved by him over the course of his lifetime and that in the mid-90s were sent by his relatives to the National Institute of History and Anthropology within the context of a public summons meant to gather documentation about family life in the 20th century. By that time, 10 years had already passed since Robles died, which is the reason why this file contains posthumous documents related mainly to the museum dedicated in the early 90s in his hometown, and that paradoxically exalts Robles as an example of the revolutionary woman. I go into the museum in what I have published. So I won't go into the museum today. Both files share a lot of similarities because they were complied with the same purpose, to gain recognition for Robles as a veteran of the Mexican Revolution. Yet there are also differences. The main one being the military file contains documents and photos irrelevant to the veteran status issue. For example, there is the studio portrait in the urban dandy pose we just saw, or the ID cards accrediting Robles as a member of both the Socialist Party of Guerrero You can see the signature. The Central League of Agrarian Communities of the Republic. And the Zapatista Front. However, there is a major gap in both files that is particularly meaningful in his personal file. Papers related to his socio-economic status. Except for his ID card as a member of the local Cattle Ranchers Association, there are no documents providing information either of home or ownership or land possession in his town. Nor are there any papers that record the donation Robles made of the property where a school was built in his town, or paperwork confirming the ownership of cattle. Not that he was a wealthy rancher, but he did possess sufficient economic resources to provide him with certain stability, allowing him to own even horses, which he loved. I believe the absence of this document is due to the fact that being a small landowner does not fit in with the idealized image of a revolutionary member of the Zapatista movement who rebelled against big landowners. And it is that, in my opinion, Robles joined the revolution out of personal dissatisfaction, not out of a need for economical or political vindication. Understanding an archive requires both a comprehension of the institutions that produce the documents and the motivations of the subjects involved in the processes. The Robles archive contains documents produced by the state, particularly by the Secretariat of National Defense, and specifically by the National Commission of Veterans, established in 1939 during the administration of General Lázaro Cárdenas. This office was in charge of receiving, approving, or rejecting requests for veteran status. From 1939 to 1970, the Commission received around 60,000 requests, that is to say, an average of over 1,600 per year. The figures show that veteran status was a widespread aspiration and that a great many people felt themselves deserving of such a distinction. The applicants acted partly out of a desire and affective need to be recognized as participants in the revolution, but in many cases they also aspired to receive some sort of economic compensation or assistance in securing a government job. It is worth pointing out that the regulation for awarding veteran status mentions only its symbolic value. However, economic support was awarded on a discretionary basis. Another agency that produced documents for the Robles archive was the National Confederation of Veterans, an organization formed in 1931 that Amelio Robles joined in 1948 during the presidential administration of Miguel Alemán, who favored the recognition of revolutionary service as part of the seniority required for public servants seeking retirement. Robles was not a public servant, but perhaps he was inspired to join the National Confederation of Veterans during a period when the Mexican government was providing greater impetus to urban modernization than to rural development, despite the fact that the society continued to be fundamentally agrarian. Being a member of the Confederation meant forming part of a lobbying group capable of providing political backing to its affiliates within a socio-political environment that was rapidly changing. The country was undergoing the reorganization of its political forces in response to changes in the international context and founding of the Institutional Revolutionary Party in 1946. One of the requirements for affiliation to the Mexican Confederation of Veterans was to present a medical certificate, something Robles obtained from Dr. Pedro González Peña, whose office was located in Mexico City. The doctor certified the applicant's age, good health, and the scars from 6 bullet wounds in different parts of his body. He also implicitly certified the male gender of Amelio Robles, making what scholars would call a culturally reasonable conjecture, parting from the masculinity that Amelio Robles exhibited at the age of 59. Yes, I think that's No doubt, many other bureaucrats and military office officials made the same conjecture with regards to applications for veteran status, backed by the documents duly sealed and signed by respectable military officials. His affiliation to the Mexican Confederation of Veterans represents a moment when Amelio Robles conceived of himself as a former combatant who deserves to be recognized as such. That is to say, as a former combatant who has the right to considerations for having participated in bellicose actions during the armed period of the revolution. However, I believe that at the time, Robles cared more about the symbolic recognition granted by belonging to an association that recognizes masculine identity via an impressive diploma emblazoned with 3-color stripes and ID card. This was a nationalist revolutionary masculinity endowed with prestige, especially as of 1939, the year when veterans occupied a place of honor that was increasingly important in the anniversary rituals commemorating the revolution. From my point of view at that time, this meant more for him than the possibility of material gain. After joining the National Confederation of Veterans, some years went by before Robles initiated in 1955 procedures to request veteran status before the national defense. Perhaps he let time pass because his lands and cattle kept him busy, or because his affiliation with the Zapatista Front offered him protection and political connections in his locality. Perhaps it also took him some time to decide to take on the red tape that he knew would be long and cumbersome, requiring multiple trips to Mexico City, fortified by economical development as a political and administrative center of the country. When he presented his request to the National Defense, Robles already possessed at least one letter vouching for his revolution participation. It had been issued by Division General Adrián Castrejón, his old-time friend. In subsequent years, he obtained several more letters vouching for his actions during the armed state. Generals Román Díaz Rojas and Benigno Abundes Chavez issued him certificates of merit on January 2 and 5, 1955. General Rodolfo López de Nava, governor of Morelos, gave him a letter of recommendation in 1956. Lieutenant Esteban Estrada in September 1956, whereas Ignacio Catalán Bernal, municipal president of Zumpango del Rio, did the same in 1958. The letters relate feats of battle in an apparently objective fashion. However, more than describing events that had taken place many years before and that had already become blurred recollection in the memory of those involved, their purpose was to satisfy the requirement established by the National Commission of Veterans. This becomes evident in the letter Robles addressed to General Almazan, requesting a certificate, this is a quote from Robles' letter, a certificate regarding my services to the revolution under your command, which would indicate that I had obtained the rank of colonel by procuring an accommodation, I underscore accommodation, of promotions in the form which you consider most adequate, given that these are the things required by the Secretariat, without taking into account the reality we experienced in the revolution that consisted of no one paying any attention to such things. By such things which were not important in wartime, I understand that Robles referred to documenting his promotion in keeping with military rosters. And so no doubt would remain that the required certificate had to first and foremost satisfy the National Commission of Veterans. Robles concluded his request by stating, I do not provide you with details of the other war actions here because it is my wish that they correspond to your service records. It was clear that when proceeding veteran status, what mattered most was the making the facts certified by recognized revolutionaries and those reported by applicants concise. Perhaps that is why the certificates he received from Diaz and Abundes refer to exactly to the same events as the relation of actions presented by Robles, and the only ones mentioned in the official documents in which Robles informed being awarded the veteran status in 1970. On the other hand, recommendations from Division Generals Castrejón and López de Nava go unmentioned despite the fact that they held the maximum military hierarchy. At any rate, what I'm interested in emphasizing is that the letters were issued to Robles as a male, despite the fact that at least Castrejón, Esteban Estrada, López de Nava were aware of the transgender identity of Robles, given that on other occasions they referred to him in the feminine as La Coronela Robles. Castrejón spoke of Amelio Robles to the journalist who interviewed Robles for a newspaper in 1927. Estrada told Gertrude Tubby about the revolutionary female colonel from Guerrero and accompanied her to Robles' home in the early 40s. As for López de Nava, he told tales about La Coronela in the feminine in his memoirs published in 1995. However, in official documents addressed to the authority, all three military men referred to him in the masculine as Amelio Robles. The attitude of these three military officers, two of them division generals who would eventually govern the states of Guerrero and Morelos, shows a flexible or perhaps ambiguous vision with regards to the pre-established requirements for awarding recognition of veteran status. Since they held Robles in high regard and respected his masculinity in war, they did not betray the secret of his transgender identity in the veteran status application process because this was about recognition of the highest importance, and they considered Amelio Robles deserving of becoming a veteran. That is to say, due to the respect merited by recognition of veteran status, they were willing to adapt or accommodate reality to satisfy both the requirements of the Commission of Veterans and the desire of Robles to be recognized as a male veteran. If they were willing to certify military actions that perhaps they did not recall, they were also willing to vouch for the masculinity of Robles. In order to evaluate the seriousness of these letters, it is worthwhile to contrast them with a friendly, unofficial letter that Lieutenant Rodriguez Ochoa addressed to Coronela Robles in 1978, simply to send his greetings and manifest his concern over his health, her health. If Robles garnered letters of recommendation in masculine, obtaining a birth certificate, a basic document of identification, was the next step to follow. I can only speculate that Robles bought this document and that the Commission of Veterans accepted without question. The acts of corruption of public officials at all levels of the states were frequent and would eventually trigger scandals so outrageous that President Adolfo Ruiz Cortines initiated his administration with a campaign to moralize public administration. There are no studies about the effectiveness of these anti-corruption measures, but we may assume that were limited in scope, given that Amelio Robles succeeded in obtaining his birth certificate the way he wanted it in the year 1957 during the Ruiz Cortines administration, no less. Obtaining the veteran status was a long process, partly due to the large number of applications and the slowness typical of bureaucratic red tape. Not until 1970 did Robles receive the correspondent decoration. Yes. This is then an ID card of the National Confederation of Veterans stating that he's a veteran. By that time, Robles was already an elderly man in his 80s. His health and economic situation had deteriorated, and the possibility of obtaining not only the medal but also the concrete economic benefits had become an objective. Perhaps this is why Amelio Robles took up the application once again and, more importantly, agreed to back up the campaign supporting presidential candidacy of Luis Echeverría, who sought to legitimize his administration and the institutional revolutionary party through a political modernization that was referred to as democratic openness. This policy sought to improve the image of the administration, severely damaged by the repression of the 1968 student movement and the guerrilla movements that had gained strength in the state of Guerrero, precisely where marginalization and poverty were relentless despite the economic achievements of modernization of the country during the so-called Mexican miracle. Veteran status was awarded to Amelio Robles in August 1970, a few months before Luis Echeverría's inauguration as President of the Republic. In previous years, Robles had obtained 2 economic stipends from the federal government that allowed him to cover medical expenses, although he did not obtain a pension as a retired military officer. During this final stage of procedures, the documentation continued to be addressed in the masculine to Amelio Robles, who maintained his male appearance upon attending official events as well as in private gatherings. I think that's the moment of that decoration. And then I have a family picture. He is with his nephews. According to Stoller, archives are both a corpus of statements and a depot of documents, both sides of imaginary institutions that fashion histories as they conceal, reveal, and contradict the investments of the state. Thus, the Amelio Robles archive not only documents tensions regarding his transgender masculinity, but at the same time shed light on certain political and cultural dynamics that modeled the Mexican nationalist state during a period of accelerated modernization that extends from the late 30s to the early 70s. It is a broad lapse of time during which Mexico transitioned from revolutionary nationalism to the intense growth known as the Mexican miracle, which began after World War II broke out. The period also encompassed the urban modernization that displaced rural areas as priority in public investment, as well as a crisis of this growth model that was manifested through farmer and worker protests within the framework of political alliances that characterized the Cold War. Thus, the Robles archive offers insight into certain aspects of the political history of the Mexican state in the 20th century, which include the crucial importance of the memory of the Mexican Revolution, embodied by the veterans themselves, to a government that had founded its legitimacy on continuity with the past, the tension between the government backing industrialization, growth, and urban modernization in a fundamentally rural country, the penetration throughout society of the dominion of the institutional revolutionary parties through organizations such as the National Confederation of Veterans or the Zapatista Front, and the endurance of the political relations of nepotism and corrupt practices in the states. These are large-scale processes that nonetheless left their mark on documents that relate the script masculinity of Amelio Robles. Possibly the life story of Robles would have been lost among thousands of similar stories, and we would have no news of his career if not for his well-achieved transgender transition and the agency that allowed him to obtain a place in local political organizations, cultivating friendships with military officers who respected and had enough affection for him to extend him certificates of revolutionary merit. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. You all deserve certificates of revolutionary merit for making it out to attend this time. While my slides are getting set up, I wanted to begin by thanking Macarena Gomez Barres for the invitation and to the One Archive for hosting us today, and to Maria Elena Martinez for moderating this panel. And Jeff Halberstam for managing the slide. Is it?
Yeah, it's in Keynote.
It's Keynote. Okay, great. So there's, as you'll see, an unplanned, uncanny resonance between these two presentations. So which is great, actually. And I'll also be talking about the relationship between the archive and the transgender figure. And this paper, just to follow up on the one you just heard, is looking at the archive, but also in relationship to the repertoire. So thinking about Dan Taylor's work on how, and I don't reference it directly in the paper, but that might provide one point of continuity. So. In her recent book, Time Binds, Elizabeth Freeman has proposed that we understand the pull toward the past as both erotic and distinctively queer. This pull, which she names eroto-historiography, draws us towards historical figures, not out of the hope that we could connect directly with them, nor that we could rescue them from the stigma of historical omission or misrepresentation, but out of a felt sense of the past as still working within us, as enmeshed in our very sense of self. As Freeman puts it, quote, eroto-historiography is distinct from the desire for a fully present past, a restoration of bygone times. Eroto-historiography does not write the lost object into the present so much as encounter it already in the present, by treating the present itself as hybrid. And it uses the body as a tool to affect, figure, or perform that encounter. Close quote. What might it mean to feel the present as hybrid? What might it mean to use the body as a tool for this feeling, figure, or performance? Bruno Latour describes the body as located in a network of active and distributed materialism, a stage for an encounter between past and present. Something like eroto-historiography flashes up in Latour's account of what it feels like to be activated, to act within the passional imbrication of the past, pressing upon the body from its inside. The civil war of the consciousness is indeed an attempt to get well from history, not by getting over it, but by getting into it, letting it under our skin. Freeman analogizes this networked force of the past unbalancing the body to gravity. She calls attention to what she calls temporal drag, which she defines as the gravitational pull that terms like lesbian and lesbian feminist seem to exert on queer. In so doing, she poses a challenge to a familiar move in queer studies to declare gender a copy without an original. Freeman writes, and again I quote, "To reduce all embodied performances to the status of copies without originals, may be to ignore the interesting threat that the genuine pastness of the past, its opacity and illegibility, its stonewalling in the face of our most cherished theoretical paradigms, sometimes makes to the political present. Might some bodies, by registering on their very surface the co-presence of several historically contingent events, social movements, and or collective pleasures complicate or displace the centrality of gender-transitive drag to queer performativity theory? Might they articulate instead a kind of temporal transitivity that does not leave feminism, femininity, or so-called other so-called anachronisms behind? Close quote. In my talk today, I will take up this call to think temporal transitivity and anachronism. But before doing so, I also want to pick up on a moment of theoretical condensation in the above quotation. The moment where the irretrievably past is linked both to opacity and illegibility. What does it mean for the pastness of the past to be figured through what Fred Moten might term the social chromaticism of the color black? In indirectly marking blankness or blackness as tropes through which the lesbian past is to be retrieved, I want to think about how Freeman's account of temporal drag also opens out a racial reading. While Freeman uses erotic historiography to focus on post-Stonewall history for the most part, I want to look to a much earlier period in history. In thinking through this episode, I am also rethinking an earlier account that I gave of it in my book, The Amalgamation Waltz. The episode comes from the world of the motley crew of the Circumatlantic that Peter Weinbaum and Marcus Rediker have extolled, even if they do not discuss this particular story. It concerns an African American who was arrested and put on trial for theft in 1830s New York City. It is relatively well known, having been detailed especially well by Jonathan Ned Katz in Love Stories, Sex Between Men Before Homosexuality. Briefly, the events are these. In June of 1836, 2 summers after vicious anti-abolitionist and anti-black riots had ripped through New York, Robert Haslam, a white mason, solicited Mary Jones, a black prostitute, on a street in Lower Manhattan. After an exchange of words, Jones led Haslam into an alley. Whether or not Haslam offered payment for what subsequently occurred, payment was nonetheless accepted, as he discovered when he found his wallet missing and strangely exchanged for that of another man. Tracking down the other wallet's owner, Haslam persuaded the man to admit to a prior liaison with Jones. The 2 men located a police officer with whom they devised an unnecessarily complicated sting operation involving the officer posing as a John in order to attract Jones. Why she wasn't simply arrested is unclear. When the officer located, propositioned, and then arrested Jones, he found several other men's wallets on her person, as well as the even more surprising discovery of her male genital anatomy. What acts the officer and Miss Jones engaged in leading up to this latter discovery are also unclear. But Peter Sawali, as Mary Jones was revealed to be, was jailed and induced to appear in court the following day, still wearing the dress and wig he had been apprehended in, where he entered a plea of not guilty to the charge of grand larceny. Could I have the next slide? In court, Sawali said, "I am a man," so I'll use the male pronoun to refer to him, although clearly his performance of gender did not comply with a normative coincidence of male pronoun and self-presentation. And just as clearly, he would have gone by other pronouns when working cross-dressed. His trial set a strange scene in which the charges against him and his embodied aberration were complexly entangled. His appearance, according to one of several newspaper reports of his trial, caused, quote, "the greatest merriment in the court, and his honor, the recorder, the sedate, grave recorder, laughed until he cried," unquote. During the proceedings, a member of the public seated behind the prisoner's box snatched the flowing wig from the head of the prisoner, occasioning a tremendous roar of laughter throughout the room. I find this whole situating of the kind of carnivalesque amidst the legal proceeding quite telling about this particular moment in U.S. Cultural history, New York cultural history. Sawali was not, however, actually charged with prostitution, cross-dressing, or sodomy. He was charged and convicted of grand larceny, as the caption, which I guess is not really visible, unfortunately, in the print circulated in the wake of his trial informed readers. Juridical and disciplinary power were therefore interwoven in this courtroom scenario, but they did not quite intersect. It was for a crime against private property that Sawali was sent to Sing Sing. Powerless to contest his legal verdict, Sawali did employ the occasion of court testimony to talk back to popular hostility to his performance of gender. Amidst derision and public shaming, he defended his deportment and mode of life, telling the court in the briefest but most telling of terms, and I quote, "I have been in the practice of waiting upon girls of ill fame, and made up their beds, and received the company at the door, and received the money for rooms, etc. And they induced me to dress in women's clothes, saying I looked so much better in them, and I have always attended parties among the people of my own color dressed in this way. And in New Orleans, I have always dressed in this way." Katz has pointed out how in this passage, Sawali testified to the acceptance from his fellow African Americans, both in New York City and New Orleans, in contrast to the ridicule and hostility of the white world of the court and press. But there's another aspect of this transcript that an eagerness to claim his testimony from a gay male or even a transgender perspective still misses. What both frameworks sidestep is Sawali's account of his own queer genesis within the society and culture of prostitutes, the whores who first dressed him in women's clothing and described him as looking so much better in them. This female sartorial and erotic agency in the making of the man monster is easily passed over in assimilating his story to a history of gay male drag. It underdescribes Sawali's self-fashioning as gender impersonation. Although he was parodied by his society, it is unclear that Sawali's transvestism was parodied. He didn't perform femininity, for instance, on stage, as in a minstrel show. Can I just show you the next slide? So, 20 years later, but this is a version of white masculinity performing black femininity in drag, and I'm trying to draw a contrast between this parodic mode of transvestism and Sawali's transing. His transing emerged out of and remained linked to the occupational milieu of female sex work. The whore's story and the occluded role of her desiring look and agency thus exerts a temporal drag upon our eagerness to receive Peter Sawali's story as an account of 19th century sex between men. Femininity was a prime point of anxiety at the time of Sawali's arrest and trial, and today as well, the war on women. The press had a field day with the lurid details of the case, describing Sawali as a great he-Negro who generally promenades the street dressed in a dashing suit of male apparel, and at night prowls about the Five Points and other similar parts of the city in the disguise of a female, for the purpose of enticing men into the dens of prostitution, where he picks their pockets, if practicable, an art in which he is a great adept. As a man, Sawali is dashing but seemingly harmless. In the disguise of woman, however, he entices men into spaces where he can unman them, stripping them of both honor and property. And the newspapers could not resist passing along the salacious details of Sawali's bed trick. To sustain his pretension and impose upon men, the New York Sun wrote, Sawali had been fitted with a piece of cow pierced and opened like a woman's vagina, held up by a girdle. Notice how here the vagina is not figured simply as penetrable, but as imposing itself on a deceived penis. Placing these details in Latin did not prevent this imposition from entering urban folklore, because when Sawali shows up again in the historical record a decade later, he is referred to as the notorious Beefsteak Pete. Shortly after his conviction that June, to 5 years of hard labor, he acquired another sobriquet when Henry R. Robinson, a New York caricaturist and lithographer, published this, the color portrait you just saw, a color portrait of him dubbed the Man Monster, and sold it from his shop on Portland Street. Actually, could we just go back to this? Because I'm going to talk about it a little bit. This hand-colored lithograph has been reproduced in several works of 19th century history, including my own. In the amalgamation waltz, I asked why African American histories of the period leave Sewalley unchronicled. I argued that even though he represented his way of life as an accepted and authentic part of plebeian black culture of his day, a politics of respectability has kept his story from being given as evidence of social acceptance of gender and sexual diversity in the antebellum black community. But it has increasingly occurred to me to ask why this image is so regularly reproduced in queer scholarship, including my own. What gives it, and the cross-dressing man of color it purports to represent, such historical visibility within the context of queer history? What do we seem to want from it, and does it really accomplish that thing? The man monster is amply sized at 14 inches wide and 19.5 inches tall. It exists in at least 2 impressions at the New York Historical Society in a subject folder entitled Crimes. It may not strike the modern eye as tabloid journalism, but that is indeed what it is. One of the earliest examples of the genre by one of the first practitioners of the profession. Henry Robinson was also the publisher of the famous image of the murdered prostitute Helen Jewett, the biggest tabloid scandal of its day. And could you go forward 2 slides? Thank you. Both his Jewett and his Sewalley prints pioneered new techniques of reporting crime using vivid and salacious imagery ripped from the headlines, with the size and lurid subject matter designed to draw attention in the bustling visual spectacle of the city. In the Helen Jewett print, the murdered prostitute is depicted on her bed, both breasts fully exposed. The man monster is not sexually graphic, but it draws on the same reservoirs of urban Gothic imagination, at once titillating and shocking the public with scenes of heretofore unsuspected depravity. As elsewhere in American culture, the line between censoriousness and curiosity was practically indiscernible. Can you go on to slide 4, please? Trade cards issued by Henry Robinson in the 1830s and 40s, the decades he was most active in New York, show us the shop window in which pictures like those of Jewett and Sewalley would have been displayed. That's on the left there. Amidst rows and columns of political cartoons, landscapes, and street scenes. The card on the right also informs us visually of Robinson's politics, which were Whig, the name of the political party opposed to President Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party. One slide forward, please. Another political print gives us an interior view of both the print shop and its political culture. Here, the artist Edward Clay depicts Robinson confronting political rivals who threatened to close down his establishment after the election. Robinson is depicted by Clay, who is his business and political ally, as a respectable and upstanding gentleman being harassed by scurrilous thugs, even as the newsboys on the left are shown requesting more copies of his latest print, illustrating the popular legitimacy of his views. Loco Foco Persecution, which is the title of this cartoon, is thus a self-reflexive representation of the visual political culture of its day and of Henry Robinson's place and the place of his shop in it, as he imagined it. But we need to look beyond this preferred self-image, which is also a kind of affront. As owner of the means of representation, Robinson enjoyed privileged access to the first drafting and depicting of history. But how do we use the records that he left to reconstruct lives that intersected only obliquely with his? Images he may have taken far less trouble to craft for posterity. Can we read against the grain what the lithograph of the bewigged Sewalley might have looked like in the shop window of this Whig political operative? Even before a passerby read the caption, and this is my attempt to imagine this, a large portrait of an African-American woman displayed for sale in Robinson's window would have drawn the eye of the curious. Yeah, can we go one slide forward? Sure. Yeah. For those who stopped to read, the small print would decode the delicate image above, unveiling its shocking deceit. The modestly dressed woman was actually a male thief, as the little purloined wallet she clutches to her bosom now reveals. Again, I'm not sure if you can see that. This is actually an interesting approximation of how you might have encountered this image, like in public, right? You have to kind of go in closer if you wanted to actually figure out what it's about. As Karen Haltunen writes in her now classic study, Confidence Men and Painted Ladies, American culture in this period was obsessed with the possibility of being deceived by new acquaintances in a rapidly urbanizing, increasingly capitalist world of strangers. One slide forward, please. Popular literature of the day, like The Secrets of the Great City, the frontispiece of which she reproduces in her study, recounts the omnipresent threat of confidence men, urban streetwise cads who took unsuspecting groups under their wing only to defraud and destroy them, and painted ladies, prostitutes and streetwalkers who, under the veneer of a lacquered beauty, lured young men into an underworld of vice that would culminate, as happens in this story, in a dead body being discovered by the harbor police. So you can read the entire tale, arrival from the city to being discovered under the docks in the kind of clockwise fashion around the frontispiece. No need to read the book, it's all there on the cover. In this uncertain world, fashion was a site of cultural contradiction, as popular illustrated magazines like Godey's Ladies' Book, which debuted in 1830 in Philadelphia, attempted to codify. Next slide, please. Magazines like Godey's Ladies' Book attempted to codify genteel deportment in order to enable readers to distinguish sincere from deceptive members of society. Such visual culture only succeeded, Haltunen shows, in adding another layer of surface to be impersonated by the nefarious, and another degree of uncertainty for the anxious to decode. It is useful to juxtapose the portrait of the man-monster to this pedagogic visual culture of the sincere appearance and the shocking disclosure. Taking the relative absence of signs of maleness or monstrosity, take the relative absence of signs of maleness or monstrosity in the so-called man-monster. There is some slippage between the lurid caption and the portrait that, but for its race, would not seem out of place in the pages of Godey's Ladies' Book. Sawali is not drawn in the grotesque fashion that caricaturists of the day were more than capable of. Robinson himself issued dozens of scathing caricatures of figures of the day, often representing them in monstrous, hybrid, and grotesque fashion. Next slide. One of my favorites, now in the collection of the Smithsonian, depicts Martin Van Buren's head on a kangaroo's body, with the heads of 3 other political scoundrels peeping out of her pouch. So, in light of these extant representational options, the hand that drew the man-monster was deliberately restrained, even idealized. Next slide. At least visually, this is no man-monster, but a demure female beauty, depicted with all the physiognomic signifiers of Eurocentric beauty: delicate eyes, nose, gently rouged lips, her dark coloration almost an apologetic afterthought. It is as if the artist wished to collaborate, at least in part, with the deception he aims at the same time to expose. We see this ambivalence in the visible trace. I'm not quite sure if you can see it from where you sit, but we can, if you were closer, you could see this ambivalence in the visible trace of an indecision the artist had in rendering the jawline, starting with one before, on second thought, adding another, deeper, and ostensibly more masculine profile below. This double line discloses the deceptive undeceptiveness of the portrait, as its claim to depict events drawn from life ran up against its equal interest in activating and intervening in the codes of idealized identity of its day. In its idealized and realist gestures, the portrait simulates the genre of fashion illustration, and taking its place within that genre, the portrait poses an impertinent question to its viewer. Is this what the ladies of New York should be wearing in the summer of 1836? When newspapers mocked the details of Sewallie's wig, jewelry, and attire, they did so in prose that mined the elevated diction with which women's fashion was described in magazines, with French phrases and references to textiles imported, exotic textiles. In so doing, they paid tribute to the unregulated powers of self-fashioning, propagating a confidence trick that they sought to police. While we imagine race to be secured to the body through stable and visible signs such as color of skin and texture of hair, textual and visual representations of Sewallie presented a body that masked almost every one of its surfaces, and that, even when exposed in pornographic detail, came equipped with prostheses that detach sexual function from bodily form. Perhaps it is no wonder that the man-monster seemed to scramble the existing powers of visual exaggeration, such that his monstrosity could only be conveyed paradoxically by drawing it within the lines of the most prescriptive of conventions. Dandy by day, painted lady by night, both were fascinating impostures and seductive threats. Somewhere between the spectacle that he was and the one he was made into, the past pulls out of balance with a history that seeks to fix things fully in place and for the record. We can no more fix this history than could Henry Robinson, upstanding stalwart of society, could defend against the social turbulence of his era. With his top hat, mutton chops, and prosperous belly, Robinson could afford to look down at Sewallie, much as he looked down at the scurrilous locofocos who came to disrupt his place of business and to censor his freedom of political speech. In 1842, however, Robinson encountered a reversal of fortune when a bipartisan group of political grandees came to arrest him for selling pornographic books and pictures, of which it was discovered during the raid his shop had a trove worth at least $20,000. In Licentious Gotham, Erotic Publishing and its Prosecution in 19th century New York, Donna Dennis reconstructs the subsequent trials and their relation to an emergent definition of obscenity in American law. So I think here I'm thinking about how the archive works as an apparatus and how we need to situate the hypervisibility of one particular portrait from Robinson's archive with this literally obscene, offstage archive, obliterated archive, that's represented only in the form of an obscenity prosecution. Dennis's most fascinating finding, for my purposes, is the centrality of representations of female same-sexuality in the pornographic literature sold by upstanding gentlemen like Robinson. Repeatedly, she finds scenarios of female voyeurism, female dominance of men, and sapphic sex as characterizing this literature. This is not to deny that men bought and read Robinson's visual and literary pornography. Indeed, as Dennis notes, Robinson's success as a pornographer reveals, quote, a demand among male readers for stories that eroticized female agency and male passivity in the sexual sphere, unquote. I find this formulation to be a key to understanding the man-monster as a sapphic tale. For what is the man-monster story if not one of an eroticized female agency over male passivity and bewilderment? In the 1830s, the lines among sapphism, prostitution, and female autonomy were blurred in both fantasy and everyday life, Dennis argues. If she is right, then a story such as Peter Sewallie's would have resonated within a profane vernacular culture that was indeed fascinated by same-sex acts, but, at least in this case, by same-sex acts and desires among women. Even the description of the sexual act for which Sewallie became notorious takes on a different position in relation to this history. Sewallie was not described as sodomizing Haslam, nor of being sodomized by him. He was described as imposing his vagina upon him, a vagina that while prosthetic, still held the power to name the man to which it was attached, not once, but twice. First as the transvestite female prostitute Mary Jones, and then as the dandy beefsteak Pete. I want to associate this agency of naming with what Fred Moten calls the sexual differentiation of sexual difference, a phrase that bespeaks the network of forces that condensed around Mary Jones's laboring, performing, eroticized, and exhibited body. After his trial, Peter Suwali reappears in historical annals a couple more times. In the mid-1840s, after his release from prison, he is described in the press as, quote, playing his old game, sailing along the street in the full rig of a female, unquote. The image of insouciance conveyed in that phrase, sailing along the street, conveys such a confidence and willingness to flaunt in the face of a punitive notoriety that even those who laughed and made mock seem to have begrudgingly come to respect him. Even after exposure and imprisonment, he was playing his old game, the confidence man as painted lately, infuriating and exciting those who attempted to capture his quicksilver subjectivity in prose, in print, or even behind bar. His rig soon sails out of view of the historical record, but this exit only provides another entrance into the imagination, as we see in a contemporary portrait from the artist Leslie Sarr, the con art of Peter Suwali. I think it's the next slide. This is from 1998. Taking the Robinson print as a point of departure, Sarr's image unveils, through doubling, layering, and allegory, the constitutive role of imagination and erotic historiography in what we too quickly call evidence. It is an erotic historiography insofar as the anonymous stuff of history, the found landscape paintings, which he makes the canvas out of, or the surface on which he paints, the found landscapes she buys at flea markets become the backdrop for a vibrantly colorful portrait of Suwali. Indeed, her technique reminds me of Walter Benjamin's aphorism regarding visual memories that lie latent in the archive that only the developers of the future will bring to light. Sarr's technique seems to make of her such a developer of the future. Although she worked on this portrait with only a reproduction of the Robinson print as reference and no other historical information, her portrait intuitively keys into the doubling of the body as network. Next slide. These are two details of the same painting. Suwali's face is repeated in male and female aspects, like a Siamese twin joined at the cranium. Sarr's work in showing the layers of dream, assemblage, and desire that are always at work in efforts of historical recuperation places a convex plate around Suwali's neck, reminding us that the image comes down to us because Suwali, however guilty, was, in a sense, framed, punished via the same mechanisms of visibility he made his own. In showing his doubled self upside down and off to the side, Sarr unbalances the bundle of the historical body, setting it loose from the gravitational pull of settled identities. This is why I want to claim it as an exercise in visual erotic historiography. Earlier I asked what attracts so many of us to the Suwali print, what we want of it. One thing we clearly want is evidence. Evidence that we existed, whoever the we in this case might be. Suwali may give us this, but how? Not as evidence of a fixed identity transmitted across history, but of an archive of embodied counter-conduct, conduct that replicates without reproduction, linking past and present not through sameness, but precisely through difference. To quote Freeman again, some bodies, by registering on their very surface the co-presence of several historically contingent events, social movements, and collective pleasures, enact a kind of temporal transitivity. Suwali seems to perform this kind of temporal transitivity whenever his image resurfaces in unexpected locations, such as Sarr's painting, or, as I recently learned, in a tattoo that a contemporary queer has had inked to her arm. Next slide. Betty Navy was kind enough to share this photograph of her tattoo with me, and I leave it with you as a closing homage to the person she calls the original troublemaker. I have to say that after all my years of working with the Swahili print, wearing plastic gloves and adopting a carefully distanced clinical eye honed in archives and rare book rooms, it still stops me short to see a young queer take history with such insouciance and make it part of her rig with which to go sailing along the street. Thank you.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. So we have about 10 minutes, and ambivalent about just opening it up to questions. Well, I'm going to do that, and then at the end, if there's time, I'll make a few comments, but I'd like to open it up right now. Yes.
Thank you. That was a mind-blowing panel. There was so much to draw from. And I think I might be stating the obvious when I ask Gabriela. I really enjoyed your paper. There's a lot to ask you about. In the conclusion, you really draw upon that the official archive is this really important site for your work, right? And I just wondered if you could comment, because in earlier work on Amelio Robles, you looked at rumor and, photographs, and I don't know if you talked about corridos, but obviously corridos is a kind of popular memory site, right, as an archive as well. And I'm just curious because this idea that Tavia brought forward of Diana Taylor's kind of archive and the repertoire, embodied knowledge and disqualified knowledge versus the official archive, and I think it's a tension that's been running so far the last couple of days. If you could just draw out why you chose to kind of so starkly make that argument at the end about the kind of importance of the revolutionary official archive as a site for me this subject.
Well, I have been working on Amelio Robles for a long time because there have been some areas I have not been able to really understand or to write about this. And when I got this invitation for this symposium and read Scholars' book Along the Archives, I said, well, I have all those documents. I really didn't know what to do with them. But I sort of felt intuitively that this script masculinity was really important. And then after sort of preparing this paper, I said, well, I can actually use the official military archives in a productive way to sort of complement, to underscore the idea that it's a performed bodily masculinity, but also a script masculinity. I've had the papers and the ID cards for a long time, and as I really don't own the images, I really didn't know what to do with them. But now this idea of all that is contained in the archives, I think that I can sort of argue around this idea. I don't know if I answered your question. Sort of.
Yeah, it just seemed that you were trying to, I know in the other work you have brought the kind of questions, like I said, so forcefully, with the analysis of the visual photographs, etc. And it just seemed at the end that you made that turn. So I don't know. I don't know what else to say about that, but yeah, that explains it.
Yeah, I wonder if it's a matter of emphasis, because I think at the beginning, Gabriela begins to talk about how photography, pose, comportment is part of a performance of gender, but then there's this other component, which is the official documents, and how, if I may, try to review some of the way that the self-presentation of Amelio is itself part of this performance of gender, and comes to be an important way in which he is both allowed to plot himself and plots himself into a particular narrative of the nation, which I think is really crucial and is part of, we have to mention Catalina de Rauso here, and it allows me to go to the 17th century. But to talk about, this Basque nun who goes to the New World, decides she wants to be a conquistador, dresses as a man, passes as a man for 20 years, kills native peoples, is part of the conquest of Chile, is outed as a biological woman, is sent back to Spain, is tried goes through a trial, and eventually gets a dispensation from the king and the Pope and is allowed to continue living as a man. And so there is a way in which that sort of vindication and redemption of him is very much tied to an imperial role, right? Which in this case is about service, a particular service to a revolutionary state. That allows them, I think, to be able to successfully but very interesting, of course, that it's not, as Gabriela said, it's not his joining of the Zapatista movement that is emphasized in this redemption. It is his role in the suppression of a movement against Obregón, who was one of the less radical of the revolutionary generals. Not surprising that it's at the time when there are all of these revolutionary movements within Mexico. So that again, I think it speaks to. I mean, the way that I read it was it's a very important very important part of why this person is allowed to claim a certain place, and the way that we can see that through these official documents.
And I wonder if region might not play a more important role than what was highlighted in the presentation, and the kind of regionality that you were talking about, queer regionality yesterday, particularly because Guerrero is a site of counterinsurgency, and not as a site that's taken up in any redemptive way by the nation as a part of revolutionary history, as it was 60 years, 70 years early, right, during the Mexican Revolution. I just wonder if emphasizing regionality in that district, your analysis would also help. I don't know.
Yes, in the previous essay, I did emphasize how Robles is feminized in the local history of Guerrero. She is a local revolutionary heroine. And this has to do with local politics in the 50s, which I don't fully understand to the moment. And another sort of turn this paper has is the historiography of the post-Second World War Mexico is only coming out now. So I really wasn't able to go deep into the whole process of veteran petitions, because they took place in a period that hadn't really been studied until now.
Yes, following on that, I mean, both your papers are interesting because the archive that has to do with the most intimate, to use the phrase that came up yesterday, is also an archive that's absolutely inseparable from the functioning of the state, from the law and from the forensics and establishing better an identity and so forth. But I'm also wondering, I was thinking that with the locution B-state peak, I mean, that descends from an oral history, from oral claims of this, and I'm wondering also, Gabriela, if there isn't also an oral history, an oral archive about Amelio that's circulating, which you didn't talk about, but I'm sure it must be.
No, yes, there is a huge oral archive. I've used that in the other piece, and there is another oral archive that was produced in the 1970s that has to do with with Macarena's question of Guerrero being a region where there were strong guerrilla movements. So there were these radical professors that went around interviewing the revolutionaries of the Mexican Revolution, and there are a lot of references to Amelia in the female. I didn't go into that in this paper because that should be another chapter of the book, hopefully. Yes, and there is also something that I also want to mention. His family, and people in the town say that her last wish was to be buried in women's archive. That's the rumor that goes in the town, which I really discredit, because all the evidence I have. The first Polaroid I showed, it's the last picture that I know of was taken in 1976, and there's no doubt that Amelio Robles was a man. He's even wearing his zapatista bandana. I don't know if you could see that detail. Mm-hmm. Yes, but there is a lot of oral archive. But as I worked before with that, now this was my opportunity to think of that sort of what I would call traditional state archive. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that in the case of Peter Sawali, one of the interesting contrasts between these two stories is it's such a fragmentary archive, even on at the state level, right? I mean, there's a court record somewhere in the bowels of Lower Manhattan, and in a way, the kind of the popular archive, these political and moral entrepreneurs like Robinson were the ones that preserved B-State's image for history, kind of transmitted a kind of vernacular culture and an oral culture in the popular press and in this print culture. So it's actually, I see it as a particularly interesting site of contestation, where Sawali was, everything. Everyone felt obliged to sort of expose his deception and kind of repudiate and abject Sawali, and yet those hints from how he's represented in this vernacular record suggest something else, right? And then on top of that, this whole obliterated archive or censored archive, which documents even more about kind of vernacular sexual culture of the period that can only be kind of read in its negative, right? Like things become visible when they're captured, by the state and captured within juridical apparatuses. So, thank you.
Nancy?
Thank you. I think that the methodological questions that David posed, both papers are really interesting. And, I sort of say that the question of the official record, I think, is really an important one. And I'm thinking, I have some trouble with the ways that you were describing transgendering in the record. And so I think that I wrote an article about it also that talks about the military service, basically the petitions that he made. The big question, I think, is how do you read subjectivity, right, in this article? How can we make claims about subjectivity with tactical documents, right? Documents that are created either to sort of defend somebody or to request something from the state. And I wonder what the sort of connection was between that record and transgender, right? I think I missed some of that connection. Of how can we say that this particular military masculinity was any different than other military masculinities, in that it was transgender.
That's a question for me. Well, my argument for the transgender identity is that I do have references that Amelio Robles, I even have a before picture, and that she created this male presentation and identity during the revolution. I don't know much about how the process actually took place. I do have photographs like studio portraits, and that's for where I that's the base of my argument of how he sort of sculpted the body image that corresponded to his identity, to his felt identity. That's why I use that transgender. My argument goes that it was a sartorial strategy, the way he dressed throughout his life, and the use of pictures, because he could show pictures and say, well, that's me, and one of my pictures was even published in a national newspaper. He had the clipping of that interview in a national newspaper among his belongings. So that's how I argue transgender. I don't know if I understood your question or if I'm answering anything has to do with it.
Just to follow up on, I think that for me, I think the historiography of Peter Swally has gone from the history of prostitution to a kind of gay male history to, I think, some interest in thinking of him as a transgendered figure to, I think, what I'm now, I actually throwing even that into question for a couple of reasons, right? Because it seems like the narrative that can be reconstructed in the second moment that flashes up, right? It's not one of choice, right, or conscious cultivation of an identity, but actually a kind of a scriptive identity on the part of other people, and also of an occupation, right? So Mary Jones is an occupational category for Peter Swally, and he doesn't transition from one gender to the other except by day and night. That later moment in which he's referred to as sailing along the street it's seen ostensibly during the day in female attire suggested another layer to this, but it seems it interrupts, I think, some of the more conventional narratives of transgendered in which it's an identity, right? That's sort of embraced and then cultivated through self-fashioning. In fact, there's much more of a subjectivity as a site of, and the body. I think this is where the relationship between embodied, the body as a kind of archiving all these layers of power and resistance, right? Beginning with something else to say, just to kind of throw in there, which is during the trial, Swally also claims military service, ostensibly. I think probably as a cook on that's probably how he gets to New Orleans. So he probably could have claimed for military pension or something at some point, but definitely it's not a trajectory of a linear trajectory of transgender, but rather, yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested in terms of the economic dispositions of queerness, because I think that queerness tends to be in the Peter Swally story centered on Peter.
Yeah.
But actually, when you look at the legal and the visual representation by Robinson, this whole notion of deception, it's not a caricature face, it's a very feminized face. This ridiculous story about being deceived by the beef killers. It's all about these male property holders.
Yeah, exactly.
Who are engaging in a homoerotic encounter. Has to be, it's interesting that they are that they have to, in the public sphere, they have to be. And I think the interesting thing about Robinson's own later trial is that it shows this how economic resources and economic privilege correlate with certain performances of queerness. And at least the white guys with this are able to perform queer when they want to. And also have the legal possibility to distance themselves from that. I mean, there's never a hint that they're going to be charged with sodomy.
Right.
They are successfully pushed that possibility away. And I think that ability to perform queerness when you want to, and yet push it away when it could be to your social and actually quite physical disadvantage, seems to me to be also an integral part of this story.
Yeah, I mean, and it's one that has come out kind of, and in part this is sort of like a revision and kind of a redo of the chapter, Swally's appearance in my chapter precisely for this reason, where, I mean, almost like thoughtlessly reproduced a single image of him, right, as a sort of site of historical queerness in the archive, without thinking really about the material history behind its production. And sort of after that I thought, well, maybe go try to figure out where did this come from, who produced it, what other images did he produce, and then you come to see the way in which, exactly as you said, the historical record is so complex and uneven, and all these asymmetries around power that are about race and masculinity, and also in capital. Right. So I just love that cartoon, ostensibly about some boring topic of 1830s politics, between Jacksonian Democrats and whoever, right? But what you see is this space in which that's how he would like to see himself, right? And you can almost imagine like the pornography hidden behind that desk, right? So you literally have this representation of white masculine public citizenship, right? And then the obscene is right there in the image. And so you have to juxtapose, you have to kind of bring together archives, some that do not seem queer, and the ones that are sort of hyper-visualized as queer, in order to put together the full story of what's happening in the period.
Well, we're running late, so I think we can do the discussion. I'd just like to sort of make one final observation that kind of links to some of the discussions that we had yesterday about the legal archive, about official archive, about trials, criminal records, government petitions, and both how they're problematic and have to be read very carefully, obviously, but also possibilities into accessing the relationship between large processes, state formation, urbanization, revolutionary nationalism, and lived experience, and in the way of one of the ways in which we can try to link macro and micro level processes, but also in the way that these large processes end up having real effects on bodies. And I wonder if we can think about, perhaps maybe thinking about more about the tattoos on the body and the wounds in Robles' body as also kind of perhaps as an archive itself, both marks on the body, wounds on the body, and what they can tell us about the past and the way people live it. So thanks very much, and thank you to
Thank you to those who invited me. As David said, California is one of my home, but a home I have been separated from for many years, so it has been quite nice to be back. So I'm not speaking about a forthcoming book or a chapter in a book or something, I'm going to talk about what I do right now in recent years. So it's about constructing an archive, the archive of the living present. How do you do that? On the one hand, to fight to get an erasure in France and in the overseas department against the recent past. We will accept to talk about slavery and colonial status, but we will not talk about the recent present, the post-colonial moment, if you want to say, in which, in fact, new configuration of violence and power will emerge. So how do you construct this archive from, in fact, you do it out of nothing and like that. So as we used to say in the 1970s, where are you speaking from? D'où tu parles? So when as I say, I'm speaking in fact from my work now as an activist. David said I'm a consulting professor at Goldsmiths, which does not mean that I'm teaching. And I was working on that museum project until 2010, and then I was fired. So it's also, I'm not saying that this is a very, it's more than doing academic work. It's just an accident of life, it happened. Also, you get fired, you lose your job, That's, I'm not the only one like that. And so I'm speaking from the work also from this experience of a defeat, of a setback, of 6 years of work being erased, absolutely erased. You will not find them on the internet. I mean, the work we did in Rhode Island was erased. You will not find the publication. They are taken away. So I will talk about what we tried to do by constructing that archive at the time. And also what I've been doing, therefore, in France. I came back to France in 1995 after my PhD. I never got a job in French university, so I've been teaching in England. But from 1998, I've been involved in France around the memory of slavery. Until 1998, slavery was not a thing in France. It did not exist. It never existed. Slavery existed with, these bad Americans who had been lynching black people for black people. But the French never did that. In 1998, it was the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in the French colony. And the socialists were in power, and they decided to celebrate French abolitionists. That France has given us freedom. France has been, and it was white freedom, and France has been very generous. And I say we because we were some, people, and we started to discuss, and we said, this cannot go on like that. We have to change the narrative. And on May 23rd, 1998, we were around 50,000 people in the street of Paris, and we marched and we were celebrating the slave. And from then on, there was a shift in France, and this was in fact at the end of that year, the first proposal as a National Assembly to declare self-created several crime against humanity were then. And then it was discussed in 1999. The only condition the socialist government said that the word reparation should not appear. That was the condition. Otherwise, no discussion anymore. So that was accepted, but at the same time, the law was voted in 2001, and the law demanded that a committee be installed, and the committee was installed in 2004. Marie Spondet was the writer for Guadeloupe, was the president, I was the vice president, and I became the president in 2008. And our work has been to say, what do we do in school, what do we do in the university, what do we do in the museum, so that the French people will learn about that history. And they will understand the history of France. It's not the history of people in there, it's their own history. So we have been doing, this is the work I've been doing, which means a lot of things, a lot of educating the French about art, talking with the minister, going to do things. So since 2006, there is a National Day of the Memory of Slavery and the abolition in France on May 10 every year. We also fought for changing textbook and school programs, and we repeated so much that there was nothing research. And in 2006, the National Center of Research on Slavery was created in France. And on March 25 of this year, the memorial of the abolition of slavery was opened in Nantes. And it's a memorial in which you can read text against slavery. And we say, okay, you should not have just text by the French philosopher. You have to have text also in Creole, because Creole had been the language of the slave of the French colony. So we have text in Creole, Haitian Creole, Guadeloupean Creole, Viennese Creole, Martinican Creole, and Raymond Creole because they are different Creole. And we also say we need to have text also from songs and poetry, because it's not just law, the slaves were also through their song and through their poetry and through what they were saying. This was also the circulation of the idea about freedom and equality. And so this is kind of terrain this is where I'm speaking from. So rather than presenting like a paper, as we say, I want to put forward some women. So when I say first, it's an archival defeat or a setback. And how do you write about this? How do you write about what just happened? And it was a project on Green Island which was financed by the local council. And we were a team of 20 young people, and I decided that we would take young people from the island, because otherwise you don't have, we'd have to bring people from France, and as you know what people will come. And so we will train them while we are doing it, so we know it will be difficult. I know that sometimes we say that defeat may be pregnant with future victories. But I wonder if it's not just a defeat, and it was a temporal moment, an ephemeral moment. Somebody did something will perhaps come back. I don't know what. I cannot know. But how do you write about that? And also why the project was in fact cancelled. So this was a project of a museum in Réunion, as I say, and it was called La Maison des Civilisations du Période. And when I started to work in 2003, was like, why do you build a museum on an island where people the majority of people are poor, under the poverty level? You have 20% of illiterate people. You have 60% of unemployment rate among the young people, and 30% rate. You have everything comes from France. You are totally dependent on France. You don't have, everything is imported. 60% of everything we consume is imported from France. So what is it to build? Why would you spend money to do that, And of course, one of the arguments was that we should build a housing, and that was also the attack by the conservative. So we need to think, and I was thinking of Audrey, I don't know if you know Audrey, in the 1800s, say, why do we need a poet in time of distress? So I reformulate the question, why do we need culture in time of distress? Because this is a time of distress, of economic crisis, and new form of predatory economy. So it was to try to answer that, why effectively we deserve to spend money on our culture. The project of the museum, so it was both answering to this question, saying to the people, yes, you deserve to have a museum. Your life, your history deserve a museum. You did not, as a necessary say, we did not build castle and beautiful thing, but we built a culture and language. So it was also so construct the archive about that. And I suggested also we will take another temporality. We were not born out of French colonization, even though it was starting from French colonization. We did not have any native population on Réunion. The French colonized in the 17th century and whatever. But we say this island is in the Indian Ocean. The Indian Ocean, you have a connection between Africa and Asia for centuries. And so we will follow the monsoon movement. We will do that. We will enter another time and space. We will enter the time and space of the Indian Ocean, and we will situate ourselves within that. So we will not be as if our ancestors were expecting white people on the shore to come and take them as slaves or indentured worker or settler. We came from also already complex society, and society which are exchange. So we situate ourselves on the African-Asian axis rather than the colonial axis. We say the colonial metropole is one among other, and in a way it's on the periphery. This is a periphery. Europe is a periphery. We are, in fact, in another world. So that was suggesting a temporality which was not the French colonial temporality, and a space which was not that, and in which France was in the periphery. Of course, it was important because we were a French territory, but it was just one among other. So this did not please a lot. As I said, we were really questioning the cartography of the French narrative and of French thought, which is in fact exactly it's very similar. So we are totally at the margin of the margin of the margin. So we question that. And but how in fact this cartography of the French narrative and French thought arrived? why this erasure of the colonial past? It did not happen just like that. In fact, if we retrace the history of and I will say 1920s to 2000, I'm not going to be further. In 1920s, in fact, it's the first time that the connection is made between European humanism and racist ideology and imperialism. In fact, it's during the war against Morocco, against Abdelkrim. There was a war, and at that moment, there was, in fact, a surrealist, first in 1925, they wrote a text called An Open Letter about the war in Morocco, in which they wrote, and I quote, "We profoundly hope that revolution, wars, colonial insurrection will annihilate this Western civilization whose vermin you defend even in the Orient." And we're talking about the Central Morocco. In 1932, René Crével, André Breton, and the Martinican surrealist Pierre Viollet and Jean-Marie Monod published a text whose title was very explicit, Murderous Humanitarianism. And it was the first time that this connection between humanitarian ideology and murder was traced in French text. And they argue that the very humanism upon which the West was built has also justified slavery, colonialism, and genocide. And this text was written even before Aimé Césaire's discourse on colonialism, which is written after World War II. But in discourse, Césaire went even further than the surrealists because he drew a direct link between the logic of colonialism and the rise of fascism. And he wrote Nazism, before it was inflicted on them, before it was inflicted on them, that they absorbed it, shut their eyes to it, legitimized it, because until then it had been applied only to non-European people. So he said that Europe had tolerated this form until then. And that was really, you see, fascism was a blood relative of slavery and imperialism. So this approach to colonialism, in fact, lasted after World War II, and we know about the Algerian War and the work of Fanon, the incredible work of Fanon, of course. And even in 1956, the letter, Césaire letter to Maurice Thorez, when he worked with the Communist Party, because the Communist Party had voted the Special Force of the Army in Algeria. And in there, Césaire warned, that he said, do not take the colonial question as a subsidiary part of some more important global matter. Colony is at the heart of modernity and what we have to understand about the world. And then that Franz Fanon. But what I want to say, so you had that moment of incredible connection with arcing back to the Haitian Revolution, to slave insurrection and colonial resistance. But in the meantime, the French colonial empire was crumbling. Indochina has been lost, Madagascar has been lost, and the African colonies had also asked for their independence. So when the Algerian War ended in 1962, French, in fact, the French thinker, French historiography became European. In fact, even when you look at the National Assembly before, it was much more diverse. You had black people in the National Assembly of France. After that, it was white. Cinema became white, media became white. I mean, Europe, France reinvented itself as being European and forgot about that in ways and so on. It was also, so you have that in the by the 1970s, 1980s. But do not forget, this is also the moment of the post-Marxism of France, whereas you have all these nouveau philosophes or other people who say, okay, Marxism has begotten totalitarianism, Marxism has inspired national liberation movement, therefore Marxism should be built out of it because Marxism is dictatorship. So in fact now it's human rights. And human rights we have to define as history. So no more, I mean the France is the place of dictatorship and violation and of vague woman and everything. So it was a mutilated cartography which emerged by that moment. A totally mutilated cartography of Europe itself, because Europe started to have its own periphery, and we see it very, very clearly with Greece today, and Spain and Portugal. I mean, in fact, Europe is France and Germany. And even, if I may say that Deepa Chakrabarty provincializing Europe is Western, is France and Germany. I mean, Deepa Chakrabarty has no idea about Greece, Spain, Portugal, what we call Eastern Europe, ex-Yugoslavia, and so on. These are also, so this kind of reconstruction of the cartography, mutilated cartography, is, I think, extremely important. So this was this post-Marxist movement, so erasure, so within that, the memory and history of the colonial world were totally marginalized and forgotten. They did no longer belong to the narrative of emancipation. The narrative of emancipation became against European. And the long history of colonization, the world that slavery had created, did not enter the narrative, of the French nation that was now again European. So this was within, in fact, that context that led, 10 years ago, colonial memory and memory of slavery re-emerged, and that project will emerge. In, erasure of the anti-colonial tradition, the new cartography of Europe, with Islam, the new enemy, the biggest enemy is Islam now, the recolonization of the world for consumption, the new form of predatory economy, the new center and new periphery. And so, as I say, even in Europe, but even in the world, when you are in the Indian Ocean, it's not so much Europe which is the center, it's India and China. And you are on the periphery of this new power. And new configuration of race, gender, and citizenship. Who is a true French? And this going again around, the Muslim men, the Muslim women who can serve the Muslim men cannot be saved. So, and it was in that context that it became important to repeat an archive, the archive of anti-colonial struggle, and also make visible the link between Russian ideology and market economy, and look at colonial memory as a site, memory of slavery and colonial memory as a site of mobilization for new social and cultural movement. Like tapping in them and to, in fact, question the national, French national narrative and European narrative and look at what was going on. So to go back to my second part, that were in this context, this project, as a consequence of the archive, Réunion Island, we say, okay, we're going to talk with the people whose life I've never recorded. Okay, you do find things about slave trials or indentured workers, but as everyone has said for the last 2 days, through the colonial archive, we say, okay, if we were building the archive of the living present, how will we do that? What do we do for the present, for the future? If it's our own responsibility and not the state of whatever institution, how we do that? How do you talk about all these invisible lives? What says that those without whom the earth will never be the earth, because we build the earth, but their lives is not ordered. So when we look at that, there is in fact, the material testimony are very few. For instance, slave. Usually, when you go to the museum about slavery, what do you see? You see chains, you see the slave ship, you see in fact, what the slave system, how the slave system identified these people. Then, enslaving them, but they are transformed, they are shot. But these people are like us, they speak, they drink, they fall in love, and this disappear behind that identity slave and slave person. So we say, okay, how are we going to bring that? And also for the indentured worker and the poor settlers and everyone, all this, the poor people of Réunion and their connection with this larger Indian Ocean world. So how, in fact, it's mostly in the intangible culture. It's effectively the culture of these invisible lives in the world. It's intangible. It's through their song, their poetry, their medical knowledge, technical knowledge, all this kind of vernacular practices. So there were different programs we initiated. One was, okay, for 1 year we said we will go through the island and say to people, what do you want to give to that museum? is the object you want to give as a testimony of your life for your future generation. And it was just 1 million. And it has to be a gift. We will not buy anything. You don't want to give, that's fine. So 600 people gave some object. And they were, for instance, a union card, card, or there was a guy who gave us all the fishing pole of his grandfather because he was going fishing. So it was really very tiny objet de rien, as we say in French, no value whatsoever. We could not even sell them, as antique, So, but that was for us. So we say, so the object has to mean something for you. And so we recorded what it meant for them. And we say this will be our collection. If we have object of value, these are the object of value. These have to be the protected thing. And they will say something about the people of Nyong'o at 12 moment. And then perhaps people will do this. That was one thing. Then we also created a title called Zabuton Culture, which in Creole means pillar of culture. And it was like the living treasure. People who have been doing things to protect and create and continue to create vernacular culture or vernacular knowledge or vernacular practices. So people who had Creole language, or some, for instance, a music called Maloya, which had been done by slaves in the plantation, and then was enriched by people from Tamil Nadu and everything, and which had been, in fact, until the late 1970s, never played on radio. Never, because it's music of it. Really much people around. So we celebrate that, and around that we were also trying to do a lot of job of preserving, recording text, recording songs, creating that archive which has not been done, and doing film. It was also about other knowledge. Of course we know about music, but really about other knowledge. And it was also, the archive was also reconstructing that cartography of the Indian Ocean world, and to tell people, okay, this is the map of the world, that matter, not the map that you learn at school, not the map that you see on every wall. This is the map that matters, the map of this world, and the South-South exchange. So, for instance, the idea also how the idea of socialism, communism, and so on circulated, and not just coming from there. Because they came also from China, they came from India, they came from South Africa, they imported stronger. So this kind of circulation also, South-South circulation of ideas, that even in which London and Paris do not even matter. It's not, it's not artificial, it's really do not matter. And also we were working on some vernacular practices. For instance, you have a form of theatre, popular theatre, which is played in Tamil Nadu and has been creolized in Reno Island. So we work also with people of Tamil Nadu to see how this thing was changed, different, and so on and so forth. So this was a lot, we had a lot of publication. We also tried to study, the form of slavery, because as you do, they are very specific. And for instance, in Reno, you have an incredible imbalance between men and women until the beginning of the 20th century. You have, the really poor, slaves were sometimes 70% men. There were some ship arriving with women who were sent back. So you have some plantation in which you will have 1,000 men slave and 60 female. So just imagine. So what it meant to have a world, it was a camp, of men. A large population of enslaved men controlled by a very tiny minority of white men. So what kind of what it meant in terms of gender relation, in terms of boarding, in terms of looking at that, so getting that. So all this was, publication,